I am trying to make an actual TV show.
It's so hard to find a funny show that isn't filthy. I watch them, but I don't want to.
Let's do this.
Fire, like lots of fire.
So dedicated.
So cool. Where's it go from there, you know?
Oh, have I got your attention now?
This is bigger than you can handle.
You got any plans for tonight?
What are you waiting for? Let's go.
Cool? Absolutely!
All right. Is anybody coming with us to the opening night party after at Room and Board? Gonna see you there? Come on, are you coming to have a party with us? Get some energy in this room. All right. Well, here we go. We're just quickly setting up here, and then I'm gonna bring out amazing. You just saw a lot of him up here. Renowned futurist Ari Wallach. Please come up here. As well as our moderator this evening. Thank you so much for being with us, Alysia Reiner.
Wherever you go.
Hi, guys. Welcome to the future. Thanks all for being here on this 10th anniversary opening night. Thank you so much, Ari, for being here. I am just going to fangirl for a second. Even though Ari's my friend, I'm obsessed with this show. I'm obsessed with the idea of this show because I do believe we are fed on a daily basis so much dystopia, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, that it is so important that we tell ourselves the positive stories, that we give ourselves what's possible. I think we have to feed ourselves what's possible, and this show is so about that. And I couldn't recommend this show more, like all of the episodes, but particularly the next episode is called Storytellers, and it is all about storytelling and in part our responsibility as storytellers. And I'm actually gonna, we just watched that incredible episode. I'm so curious. You can make clothes out of mycelium, right?
Yeah. They're clothes. We're working on a kind of a couch project also right now.
I want a T-shirt that says, like, mycelium is saving the world, right? Don't you want that T-shirt? I would buy that T-shirt. There is so much. You jam-pack so much into every episode, and I'm actually going to slow it down, slow the roll for a second, and back up. Raise your hand if you've read Ari's book. Okay, whoever, so Ari wrote a book called Long Path that you all have to read. It's deeply important for all storytellers across the planet and all humans across the planet. I would very briefly say it's about what does it mean to be the ancestor. Well, you wrote the book. You'll tell.
I wrote the book. So first of all, thank you, SeriesFest, for having us, for showing this. It's great to be at something like this that centers television and the unique experience that is television. I know we go to film ones and music ones, but to actually be at this in a time when people don't quite know where to put us because it's television, but how big is the screen? Sometimes it's just on a phone or an iPad, but it's a very different experience, and it's an experience meant to happen intimately, more often than not in your home. And so, so to be able to, at a place that celebrates that is very important. So the book is called Long Path: Becoming the Great Ancestors Our Future Needs. The book was in many ways kind of born from kind of the way I was raised, which was a little bit different because my father had me when he was 50. He was a teenager in World War II, born in Poland, and very quickly lost most of his family in the Holocaust. and he actually joined the Jewish underground. So for several years lived in the forests of Poland, and then after the war was a Nazi hunter, and eventually made his way to Mexico, where he met my mom, who was a student of Buckminster Fuller, kind of a futurist and architect and an amazing human being. And so my dinner table conversations were a little bit different because my father was often, I'll talk about a little bit about this in the book. My father was very concerned about and very thoughtful about how did we miss the 1930s, because he said, it was so. I was just with someone who was talking about the World's Fair in the 1930s in Chicago, and he said, Niels Bohr gave this amazing kind of demonstration of quantum mechanics. And that's what everyone remembers. What they don't remember was that Mussolini actually went to that World's Fair also, and there were people who were saluting him. And so there was those conversations. On the other side of the table was my mom was like, where are we going to be in 200 years? Because that's what happens when you train under Buckminster Fuller. So the book is very much so it's based somewhat on that, but also the work that I've been doing for 20 plus years as a futurist with a lot of different folks and organizations. But more than anything, my mission, both in the book and in this show and what we're doing with Futurific Studios, is how do we get people to actually take the future seriously? Not as this noun, not as this thing that's going to wash over us that we're just kind of rushing into, that we have no control over, but actually something that we actually create and make. And sometimes it's by people doing amazing scientific, technological things. But more often than not, the official future, the way we think about tomorrow, the way we lean in tomorrow, the way we activate around tomorrow is through storytelling. It's through the folks in this room and in other rooms who are, but obviously it's in nonfiction, but in fiction, in those stories, because that's what binds us to one another in this moment. But it also opens up our temporal aperture, not just obviously going forward, but also going backwards. And so that was the why of the book. But it's a book. And so the way it manifests, people kept saying to me while I was on the book tour, like, this gives you so much hope. There's so much on here. But, like, who's actually doing this? Who's telling, news stories? Who's doing the technology? Who's helping people think about death? All the things I kind of researched in the book, or folks I'd run across, or even little things like the root bridges that I'd kind of heard about. And I realized that's kind of how we got to the point where we're going to make a show where we're going to bring all of this to life in a medium that only exists in television.
And really, I feel like as storytellers, we have a deep responsibility. And for me, something I've been thinking about a lot recently is, as a very young human, you sort of learn things and everything's black or white, right? And then as you grow a little bit older, you go like, oh, wait a minute, there are a lot of shades of gray. And at this point in my life, what I'm most interested in is like purple and green. And what am I not seeing? I always will be like, well, it's either this or this, but what am I not seeing? What is my blind spot? And I feel like you really help open up our minds to those blind spots. Share a little bit more about that idea of dystopia versus utopia and your amazing word, protopia.
So, I grew up, obviously, on a pretty good diet of science fiction. And most of the sci-fi that I grew up with in the 80s and 90s and up until this moment, more often than not, is dystopian. It's about the world has fallen apart. And more often than not, there's actually an event that has caused the world to fall apart. At the same time, I also grew up on Star Trek. And one of the things that I learned very early on in the work that I was doing is when you would go and talk to kind of hardware and software engineers, especially hardware engineers in Silicon Valley and in technology, you'd say, what was your main inspiration? 9 times out of 10, they all said Star Trek. Well, it's these things that I saw, I wanted to make them. But there's a deeper part of Star Trek that we often don't think about, because we think about the tech, but it's the first interracial kiss on television by 15 years. There were things that were happening on Star Trek that were below the surface. Roddenberry was telling stories in different ways that we could be, and things that would normally be, let's say, a binary challenge, right? An interracial kiss, for instance. He just assumed, well, the world is already better than it was in the present. And so the idea, we all know what a dystopia is. It's the world's falling apart. Utopia really means no place. Utopia is really just kind of dystopia in disguise, right? Anytime there's a utopian story, we all know what's going to happen in Act 2. There's the reveal and the whole thing falls apart. So if those are the two binary structures that we have to talk about the future, they're both pretty bleak. And so when I walk into my daughter, I have 15-year-old twin daughters, and a couple of years ago, I went in and looked at their bookshelf. And any, I don't know who's written what in this room, so I'm not going to call it specific books, but there are books. And any of these books that take place in the future, everything's gone upside down. I'm like, oh my, this is how they see tomorrow. But the reality is, this is the best time to be alive as a Homo sapien on this planet in probably the past 10 or 12,000 years. The other day, I was doing something in my garden, which I shouldn't have been doing, but I cut myself. So I went and I washed the cut, and then I put some, Neosporin on it. 150 years ago, I would have died from that, right? Yes, we have a lot of things that are happening across the board in terms of rights and stuff that's being pulled back. But at the same time, we are progressing. So this idea of protopia isn't about a perfect tomorrow. It's about better tomorrows than we have today. It's about setting up in the moment future generations, our descendants, so they can be better off than we were right now. Now, we saw it at the end of that episode. We talked about GDP. We kind of set that up because when we think about individual and collective flourishing, it can't be through the kind of classic macroeconomic or microeconomic lenses that those of us, when I came up in academia, were trained on. So the key term here is protopia. Tomorrow's better than today, but not perfect.
I love that, and I can't remember if it's this episode or the next episode. I think it's the next episode where you talk about choosing your story. Like, you get to choose your own story on this planet. And that's something I think about a lot. I actually just played a character in a movie, and she's kind of trying to be you in the movie. She's a best-selling author, and she's a sort of a life coach, not as cool as a futurist. And the writer-director of the movie asked me, like, what should the book be called? And I said, choose your story. So I say to you, as you talk to everybody today, like, what story would you choose for our future? And what scares you in this moment?
Wow. So look, I won't ask for hands raised, but anyone here familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy? CBT? Yeah, okay. It's the hands go up depending on where you are on the coast. So it's good to see some hands went up here in Denver. I said that in San Francisco. Everyone here. Look, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is kind of like how most therapy happens right now, is really about, at the individual level, examining the storylines that we have in our head, and whether it's around anxiety or depression or phobia, looking straight at those stories, examining where they came from and whether or not they serve us or don't serve us, and then rewriting them. Because that narrative, official future, those storylines and narratives about how we define who we are need to exist. We cannot be in a vacuum space. So my work, the work of this show, the work I think of storytellers right now is indebted to cognitive behavioral therapy, because in many ways that's what we're doing. We're having to look critically at those stories. So I don't even know which episode it's in anymore because I keep watching it back and forth. Part of it, people often say, oh, you're a futurist, you just think about tomorrow. And I'm like, no, like, what my dad always said was, like, tomorrow started yesterday, right? Like we don't a lot of times futurists will be asked like, well, based on what's happening today, what's tomorrow going to be like? And I'm like, I don't know, let's go back. How far do you want to go forward? 'Cause that's how far we have to go back. And the core part of that is, what are the stories that we've been telling ourselves as individuals, who we are, as societies, as countries, as religions, as political movements, figuring out what serves us and what doesn't serve us, and then using that to center the stories that we need to write for tomorrow. Because I can tell you, and it's Kylian Mbappe we have in episode 6, world famous soccer player. I asked him point blank, I said, so when you get up to take a penalty kick, you tell yourself you're going to miss it, right? And he looked at me and was like, why would I ever do that? If you're going to tell yourself you're going to miss it, you're going to miss it. But if I tell myself if I have a vision and a goal, then at least whether or not I miss it, at least I've put my muscle memory towards executing against that. And so the stories that I think we need right now are not about what happens if things go wrong. Because there's many a movie theater and many movies out probably once a week about what happens when things go wrong, but never about what goes right. And to be totally fair, and I know this now as a studio executive, which is a weird thing to say, is what goes wrong sells. And the reason for that is because embedded in us is a negativity bias, right? We look for the things that are negative, because negative things, if you and I were walking 10,000 years ago on the Serengeti or in some plains, and some animal came after us, or we saw something in the distance, we would look at that because that thing that's negative equals death. That is a part of who we are. You'll see this a lot throughout the show. I consistently kind of go back several 100,000 years, because until we actually are open to having a conversation that we're just really advanced primates, and you can be religious and spiritual at the same time, by the way. I'm not an atheist when I say that. We can't have real conversation about where we want to go. That's one. And so two, what worries me right now is that we're going to keep telling ourselves stories and fictions about who we are and where we might be going that don't serve us. I grew up very much in a religious family, but I was always very, very into science. And so the way I reconciled that was, I was like, okay, well, religion is telling me where I'm coming from. Science will tell me where we're going. And it took me many years to actually realize we have to actually, in some ways, kind of flip that. The science is telling us how we got here and who we are. And not that religion needs to tell us where to go, but our moral philosophy, our moral software, the inner parts of us is going to be what should be dictating the stories about where we want to go. And what worries me is that we're going to allow what we're doing with AI, quantum computing, synthetic biology, for those to be about what the technology wants as opposed to what humanity wants.
Yeah, I think it was deeply powerful when the gentleman who was talking about AI said, we're in great shape as long as we lead the technology. And the minute we don't, the minute we're not responsible, we don't have that social contract that the college students talked about, I think we're in trouble a little bit. And I think, during our strike, I have to bring it back to the storytellers. During our strike this year, for that very long 5 or 6 months, one of the things that I kept on talking about was AI can never replace human ingenuity. It can augment, but I truly don't believe it can replace us. There is just something magical about the human imagination, and there's responsibility in it that is really important to bring up. So since we're at Columbia, and you were just talking about the future and the past, and when you were there, did you ever imagine that we would be here today with what's going on college campuses?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I did. I mean, I saw inklings of it. I mean, not necessarily specific to the situation in the Middle East that's happening right now, but what we are in right now, and it's a great room to be in a room with storytellers, is we are very much in a moment of narrative collapse. Mm-hmm. Right, so we have been living with an official future about what tomorrow will be, pretty much technology-centric, a better way of living that goes back 300 to 400 years, right? This is really kind of what the role and the power of the Enlightenment and really the Gutenberg press was to say the power of the story and who and what we are will be solved by science and solved by technology, and things will get better. But we're consistently seeing that if you aren't centering humanity and being human as the technology rolls out, things start to happen. I saw this in the 90s. I was very involved in presidential politics with the Clinton campaign and NAFTA, and we saw where things went when we let the technology drive. And so I'm not saying technology is bad. I'm not saying technology is responsible for what's happening right now. But all of us, and especially those who are closest to it, I'll be honest, students who aren't as embedded in the systems, who are a little bit more free to think in different ways, and I'm definitely not taking sides here, are able to kind of call bullshit on the systems right now and on the stories about what leads to something better, right? They're seeing their parents struggle and their grandparents, and they're seeing what's happening. And so the stories that tomorrow is always going to be better if we just let the tech and let the logic drive and dictate isn't working anymore.
Yeah, it's I think one of the most challenging things is the uncertainty that we're in at this moment. And as you said, narrative collapse, right? That intertidal moment that we're in. And when we were watching that, when you were first talking about that with the ocean, I was just thinking about the importance of meditation at this moment. I'm a big meditator. I was like a TM girl, and then I had a child and I lost it entirely. And then when the pandemic happened, I picked up meditation, and it's been, I would say, the most important part of my life to stay sane since the pandemic and moving forward. I was thinking about it when you wore that cute little white cap on your head. What are your thoughts about meditation?
Benny, so in my 20s, which is like 4 years ago, I spent a lot of time at a place called Green Gulch, which is connected to the San Francisco Zen Center, Soto Zen. So I came up through a Soto Zen school. So I'm like the epitome of a Jubu, and it's interesting because people always say like, well, how do you have like a Soto Zen practice and you're a futurist? Like, how are you present in the moment, but then also mostly thinking about the next 20, 30, 300, 1,000 years? Very, very simply. And you'll see this and there's not a plug for it, but you'll see this in the book. The key thing is if we try to think about tomorrow by just purely extrapolating where we are today without critically examining who and what we are, we're going to just get futures of monorails and jetpacks, right? Which might be fine, but it's not going to lead to the kind of emancipation we're looking for. And I won't go into the tenets of Buddhism that everyone knows and doesn't want to be bored with. But what meditation does is, for me, and I think for a lot of people, and no matter, regardless of however you practice it, is in a world of constant input. Remember, the hardware, all of us here, the hardware, which is our biological systems, has really not changed that much in the past, we can argue, but between 50 to 150,000 years. I can tell you this hardware that's 150,000 years old was not meant to be in this environment. The fact that we have lights on right now that are thinking, right now your brain thinks it's still daylight outside. Like we're actually, there's all sorts of things that we mess up with. What meditation allows you to do is just recalibrate so that you can exist in a volatile, fluxing system.
I couldn't agree more. And I think it's really deeply important in this moment. You know, when we're deregulated by this intertidal moment, it's, to me, the only thing. I mean, there are lots of tools, but it's a really important thing. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Thanks a lot for bringing the show. Really like it. The first thing I thought about was that saying, the best way to predict the future is to create it. In terms of storytelling, though, certainly doomsday thrillers sell better, as you mentioned. But at the same time, most audiences, certainly Hollywood audiences, like happy endings, generally. So, where is that balance struck? Can you see that being struck?
Yeah, I mean, look. So we all know big oil, we all know big tobacco, and I talk a lot about big dystopia, right? Which and big dystopia is in everything from Hollywood and TV to being at your mother-in-law's, right? Like the whole everything's gonna fall. Sorry, I hope we're not recording that. That was like a metaphor. God. But this idea that everything's gonna fall apart and go bad. Remember, this is, go to any of your friends that are single, and ask them one question, and say, what are you looking for in a partner? What are you looking for? And more often than not, and we've done this, more often than not, they're gonna start telling you a whole list of things that they don't want. But remember, the question was, what do you want? And we immediately go to what we don't want. So again, this kind of negativity bias is baked into us because that's what actually has allowed us at a very Darwinian, a lot of my work was kind of early evolutionary genetics and biology. This is what's helped us move forward. So look, the big dystopia content isn't terrible, and we're attracted to it because it entertains us, but also tells us, because really good sci-fi, and by the way, future stuff isn't always sci-fi, but really good sci-fi is always a commentary on today. And it says, hey, look, this is happening. 1984 was a commentary on that moment. And it said, this is what might happen if we don't check this one thing or multiple things. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have dystopian, and we will continue to have some sort of dystopian doom and gloom content. We need to rebalance it, though. So my partner is Catherine Murdoch, who's also the EP of the show, on the launch of Futurific. And right now, we started during the writer's strike. So a lot of what we're doing is we're taking graphic novels that take place in better tomorrows. Look, there's still murders, there's still art heists, there's still terrible things that happen in the 2040s and 2050s. But the background of that world, of that story, is clean air, clean water, better democracy. But we still have the foibles of the fact that we're still in this 150,000-year-old platform called the Homo sapien body. So it's a balance. I'm trying to answer it without saying there has to be a binary, but there'll still be that stuff. By the way, I'll go see it. I was there opening night at Civil War. I couldn't wait. Even though I knew it was everything went to shit, I was still there. I wanted a different ending, but whatever. Didn't get it, but we can rebound, so we can tell those stories. Look, I did a bunch of work around marriage equality years ago. I'm at that point now where you try not to say the years. Years ago in New York State, and you all know where this is going, right? When we started asking people what actually shifted, especially that uncle at Thanksgiving, it was always Modern Family, or it's always Will and Grace. It was the stories that humanized. And so that's what we have to kind of keep going back to, is if we want to show better tomorrows so that my daughters aren't, who come up to me and say, I've totally lost faith in tomorrow because the only stories they know about tomorrow. And by the way, I've been in the climate movement for a very long time, very guilty of this, like the polar bear floating on the piece of ice to raise money in the short term. But what that does is it actually leads to a sense of despair, and we strip agency out of the equation. So what this show does, what we attempt to do, is show, well, these are actually people who are making it, who are actually doing it. It's not perfect. Not all of this can scale, but this is what it looks like.
And I love that with the Ocean Project of, if you're going to see something and be disturbed by it, what are you going to do about it? And reminding people being disturbed is really not enough. What action are you going to take on a daily basis? And back to what you were talking about the graphic novels and Futurific, I think, and what you were talking about, Bob, you can have a hero's journey. You can have all the conflict, and you can have a happy ending, and you can have that future that they're living in that's extraordinary. And I was thinking as you were talking, like the fun thing for us about storytellers is we don't have to actually invent the shit. Like we can pretend, we can think up something that we don't have to actually create. We can make the pretend version of it that will then inspire the young person to make the thing, just like in Star Trek, and that's so cool.
And the one thing I'll say is that, like, and I've gotten this question a lot. They're like, "Oh, that's great. Like, he's probably like some privileged kid who figured out how to like clean up the ocean patch and raise a bunch of $1 billion," and he did. I won't speak to his privilege, but it's expensive to do that. And at the same time, though, I mean, constantly in rooms, especially in DC or New York, people are lamenting the polarization in this country. It's falling apart. It's going terrible. I said, look, you don't have to invent some massive depolarization project where you're going to raise a bunch of money and like his version of the ocean cleanup. And like next time you're in a conversation with that uncle or on Facebook or on social media, recognize that your actions and your framing, even if it's only one-on-one and very small, is you actually making the future. People often say like, well, how do you make, as a futurist, I have to be a billionaire to build rockets. That's the only way you build the future. So yes, that's one way. Another way is just to hold the door open for someone coming behind you, right? Or is to actually look someone in the eye when they shake your hand or you meet them for the first time and remember their name. And I know like, butterfly, chaos, but it's actually true. Like the way I say goodbye to my children in the morning is future making. Because at the end of the day, whether or not you have kids or you're near kids, like here's what I know. I have 3 children. So in 200 years from now, that's roughly 18,000 descendants, right? So how I talk to my wife in front of my children is going to impact 18,000 people in terms of how they think partners should talk to one another and interact with one another. So sometimes it's ocean cleanup. Or it's nuclear fusion, or some of the amazing things you're going to see on the show. Sometimes it's things that are just right here, right now in front of you. And that's what, and I'm giving those examples because those show up on the show. We do some really interesting things with folks, with Reverend Jennifer Bailey, who does these amazing dinners. And she sets a set of kind of ground rules and norms on how we interact with one another that cost nothing. So some of the stuff in the show cost billions of dollars. Some of it is just a mindset.
I love that so much. I think we're out of time. But I want to thank you so much for being here and for making our future better. And to all of you, I remind you, choose your stories. And let's go party.
Thank you.